Hey y'all, welcome to this week's episode of Unfit to Print. I'm your host Amber Athey, the Washington editor for The Spectator and a senior Blankley fellow with the Steamboat Institute. This week we're covering the latest out of the Texas school shooting, Florida's investigation into its COVID numbers, Paul Pelosi's DUI, and Leah Thomas's latest interview on his intrusion into women's sports. All of that is just ahead, but first, if you're a fan of the show, please subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And as I mentioned on the show last week, our subscription tiers are now live. Go to amberathey.supercast.com to check out all of the exclusive content you can get by becoming a premium subscriber, including guest interviews, Ask Me Anythings, shout-outs on the podcast, and bonus segments. Thank you guys so much for your support, and let's get right into the show. Unfortunately, we are starting this week's episode with a rather grim topic, and that is the Uvalde, Texas school shooting, where an 18-year-old gunman is said to have barricaded himself in a classroom and slaughtered 19 children and 2 teachers. And this is already a horrific and tragic scenario, but it gets even worse when we look at the law enforcement officials' response, or rather lack of response, to what they should have known was an active shooter situation. So this tragedy starts off where this 18-year-old gunman apparently shoots his grandmother because he is under the impression that she is going to remove him from her cell phone plan. He drives down to the local elementary school, crashes his vehicle, manages to get into the school through a door that a teacher had propped open that day, barricades himself in the classroom, and then goes on to massacre everyone who was inside, while police wait outside. As they can hear gunshots, as he's killing children, the police just wait. And when you go through the response, it's really mind-blowing as to how it took so long for them to finally rush this classroom and take out this shooter. So according to all the reports so far, and I want to point out, by the way, that when this shooting first happened, we were told very different things for at least a couple of days before we started to get a clearer picture of what exactly law enforcement officials did when this shooting was happening. It actually took quite a while for us to get a full accounting and a full timeline of the events that day. And even Texas Governor Greg Abbott said that he was misled about what exactly police officers had done, and that he was livid when he found out that they had not given him the full information, leading him to give misinformation actually at a press conference where he was supposed to be updating the public as to the latest developments in the shooting. So now that we apparently have the full account of what went on, we know that outside of the school, there was a heavy police presence there as this gunman was inside the classroom. And parents were actually outside because they had heard of an active shooter situation. People inside the school were calling 911. So the parents showed up and started begging the police officers to please go inside and try to stop this guy. And instead of heeding these parents' cries for help or listening to the frantic 911 calls that were coming from children inside these classrooms, the police not only continued to wait outside, but they also started detaining the parents and trying to push them back from the scene as they were hearing the pop of gunshots and the potential of their own children being killed inside, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. So finally, apparently there are 19 police officers that make their way into the building, but instead of trying to rush the classroom, they wait in the hallway, which goes against every active shooter protocol. In every law enforcement response, tactical response to an active shooter situation, the cops are supposed to rush the situation. They're not supposed to wait for backup. They're not supposed to wait for a tactical or SWAT response. They are supposed to try to engage the shooter as quickly as possible to stop him from taking more casualties. Because in an active shooter situation like this is not a hostage situation. There's no negotiation to be had. They're not trying to make sure that they can get these people out unharmed by talking to the shooter, they have to take this shooter out. That is the active shooter protocol. And there are so many questions as to why these police officers did not follow that protocol. And I believe in several comments, the police chief and some of the higher ups sort of suggested that they were worried about getting shot. And I'm sorry, but if that's the case, you're in the wrong line of work. Police officers understand when they take that oath to protect and serve that there is a possibility of putting their lives on the line for other people, especially for innocent children who are trapped in a classroom with a deranged shooter. And in this case, instead, they waited out in the hallway. Finally, more than an hour after the shooting starts, the Border Patrol arrives. Local Border Patrol units show up at the school, and they take over the situation. They end up getting a master key from a janitor who's able to open the classroom door for them, and one of the Border Patrol agents takes this guy out. That should have been the first reaction as soon as they knew that this shooter was holed up in this classroom. The fact that it took them over an hour to do that, as these children were begging for help, is unconscionable. There was even a statement from one of the police chiefs that said they were glad that they were able to manage this scenario without any police casualties. I mean, that's nice and all. I'm glad that no police officers died, but that's not really something to be bragging about when you essentially protected yourselves over the lives of these children who you have been sworn to protect. So this is just such a horrible addendum to what was already a tragic situation, and you can't help but believe that there could have been potentially dozens of lives saved if these police had actually followed what is supposed to be active shooter protocol, had run into the line of fire, and taken this guy out. Ultimately, there were 19 police officers in that hallway with one shooter in the classroom, and all of them were apparently too cowardly or too stupid to go in and take care of what needed to be done. And it finally took Border Patrol to come in and save the day. And it turns out the Department of Justice is now investigating the police response to the shooting, as they should. This is a much better use of DOJ's time, by the way, than investigating parents who protest school board meetings. These are the kinds of situations where the DOJ should be getting involved and saying, what the hell happened here? How did the response break down so badly? And what kind of mob mentality took over this police force to the point that they were unwilling to risk themselves to save these elementary school children? It really is unbelievable. And despite this very obvious failure of law enforcement, all of a sudden the left, of course, started making this situation about guns. Remember back a couple of weeks ago, there was another shooting in a grocery store. And the narrative after that shooting was not guns, it was about white supremacy, because the shooter who was a avowed leftist, by the way, was intentionally killing Black people because he was a white nationalist or a white supremacist. And it's fine for people to talk about this guy's motivations. I think that's totally valid. But in doing so, they, of course, tried to blame it on people like Donald Trump and other Republican politicians. And they didn't talk about guns then, because the more convenient narrative was to talk about white supremacy and white nationalism. Now, because the shooter in this case was a Hispanic male, they can't talk about white nationalism and white supremacy, so they go back to their old standby when shootings like this occur, which is guns. And as we know, there are millions of law-abiding gun owners around the country who manage to live their entire lives without ever shooting up a school. Clearly, to me at least, the issue here is not guns, but something else. In this case, it seems obvious to me that we should be talking again about the failure on behalf of police. But Biden went out on the stump earlier this week and claimed that the problem was 9mm handguns. And he was talking about banning that specific caliber of gun. Let's listen to what he had to say.
And they showed me an x-ray. He said a .22 caliber bullet will lodge in a lung, and we could probably get it out may be able to get and save the life. A 9mm bullet blows the lung out of the body. So the idea of these high-caliber weapons is there is simply no rational basis for it in terms of about self-protection.
Yes, a 9mm gun can obviously cause a lot of damage, but that's kind of the point. I mean, so can a 40 or 45 caliber weapon, right? I mean, there are so many reasons why someone might need that type of stopping power. I'm a young woman. I'm alone at home sometimes. If some home intruder comes to try to, steal my stuff or hurt me or do whatever, I want the stopping power in a firearm so that I can put them down. If somebody's out hunting in the woods and they come across a bear, they might need a higher caliber bullet to be able to take that bear out so that they don't get mauled to death. And I mean, the list goes on, but ultimately it doesn't really matter why we want it, right? Because the real reason and the reason the Second Amendment exists is to be able to fight back against a tyrannical government. And I think it's important to point out at this moment that the Secret Service back in 2019 actually switched their guns to 9mm. And so if the Secret Service has, a 9mm Glock, I don't see why the average American shouldn't have one. So it's good enough for Biden to be protected by 9mm handguns, but the rest of us don't get that same luxury. This is the classic hypocrisy of the left. They all have their own armed guards. They have Secret Service. They have, the Capitol Police, who are all carrying certain types of firearms. And then the rest of us are just supposed to be in our homes unarmed as Democrats ignore crime and allow prosecutors to go in and not prosecute people who are accused of violent acts or break-ins or carjackings. And all of us are just SOL. It's crazy. I think it's interesting as well that Biden has chosen to focus specifically on 9mm handguns because there were several moments in history where those were actually deemed insufficient, particularly for law enforcement officers. And it was recommended that law enforcement officers upgrade to a higher caliber. So in 1986, there was a shooting in Miami where 2 FBI officials were gunned down. And one of the areas of blame was the fact that they were carrying 9mm handguns because apparently the bullet had not been able to properly penetrate the gunman and take him down. So there was a recommendation after that to upgrade to a 40 caliber weapon, which is standard issue for a lot of police still today. Then later in 1997, there was a North Hollywood shooting where 2 armed bank robbers came out of the bank heavily armored, and police were outside, and they were not able to stop these guys for a really long time, which led to many casualties because the 9mm bullets weren't able to actually penetrate the armor that the bank robbers had on. So there was the same suggestion to local law enforcement officials to upgrade their firepower because these 9mm handguns were considered insufficient for their needs in stopping criminals. Again, if that's insufficient for a law enforcement officer, I don't necessarily think a heavily armored person is going to come into my home and try to hurt me, but I would still like the peace of mind of being able to have that or something of a greater caliber in order to defend myself should something ever occur where, some drugged up person comes in my apartment and tries to do something. You just really never know. And it's a really unfair double standard if Biden gets to be protected by a 9mm or greater, but somehow bans them for the rest of us. But you're going to see sales for that caliber weapon skyrocket, just like they did when Obama suggested gun control, I believe after the Sandy Hook shooting. You also had this ridiculous meltdown from Beto O'Rourke, and you guys probably have already seen this a million times already, but he showed up to a press conference that Governor Greg Abbott was holding with local officials and law enforcement to talk about updates on the shooting. This was last week, and this was not a political press conference. This was merely to try to tell the public and the families of the victims what they knew about what occurred in regards to the shooting. And Beto O'Rourke thought that this was the appropriate moment to get on his soapbox and start crying about guns and politics and his distaste for Governor Greg Abbott. So in case you guys haven't seen it, let's go ahead and listen to this one more time.
Sit down. You're out of line and an embarrassment. Sit down and don't play this stuff.
The next shooting is right now, and you are doing nothing.
No,
you
need to get out of here. This isn't the place to talk this over.
This is totally predictable when you...
Sir, you're out of line. Sir, you are out of line. Sir, you are out of line. Please leave this auditorium. I can't believe you're a sick son of a come to a deal like this to make a political issue.
I don't think I need to tell you guys how craven of a political move this is. Obviously, Beto O'Rourke is running for governor against Greg Abbott, and he saw this as the perfect opportunity to try to make his pitch to voters. And of course, the left ate it all up. They were like, oh my God, Beto is a hero. He's so courageous. Look at this photo of him standing up to the evil gun lobby and Greg Abbott. And this is so distasteful, such the wrong moment. I mean, I am very anti the vast majority of gun restrictions. Like, there are very, very few I support. And I still support people having the debate about guns. I mean, ideally, we would be debating with people who actually understand guns and the Second Amendment, which never seems to be the case. But politics is politics. Yes, if you want to have a debate about guns after a school shooting, I get it. Have your debate. I'm not going to support anything that the left proposes, but it should be discussed, sure. But to show up at a press conference where the governor is trying to give the public an update, trying to give them information, trying to give them details, and shaking your fist and crying that he hasn't adopted the political solutions that you would prefer, as there's like family sitting in the press conference, is so gross. And Beto O'Rourke is just like the classic progressive activist who does everything in a selfish way. And I think this is most of the woke left. They do these things to make them feel better about themselves, and not because they're actually interested in solutions or fixing problems or helping Americans live better lives. A lot of them, including Beto, who is a white, wealthy liberal, do this to assuage their own personal guilt that they have just for existing. And that's why you hear these white people talk about white privilege and CRT and gender theory and all of this other weird woke nonsense, because they feel like they need to apologize to the left for just existing and being who they are. And Beto O'Rourke here is doing this in one part to have this progressive, guilt-free moment where he's going to make himself look like a hero. But he's also doing it because, again, he's running for governor. He wants the political press out of this. He wants the media to fawn over him like they did back in 2016 or 2018. And he wants to be the little darling. So this was obviously a gross move. I think it mostly backfired. I mean, I don't see who he's winning over with that desperate of a political ploy. He's just going to get the same people who were already supporting him, cheering him on. But I would highly doubt that any moderate or independent is going to see Beto O'Rourke interrupting that press conference and say, you know what, that's my guy. And all of this, again, ignores so many of the real issues at play with school shootings, which we never really talk about because we like to talk about the surface level solutions like guns or school security, which I think is very important. Like, why don't we have one entrance to the school? I saw some liberals actually saying, well, it's super unrealistic to have one entrance to a school because sometimes there are multiple buildings or the school is really big. These people are so willfully obtuse sometimes. I went to public high school, and I think maybe the last 2 years I was there, we had a one-door policy. Every other door around the building was locked, and visitors had to go through the front door, they had to check in at the front office, and they had to get some kind of badge. You couldn't just have people walking around the school or the complex, or you would be checked out by security or police or somebody. And even students, we would sometimes have classes out in trailers, or we call them portables. You would actually have to get a special key or key badge to be able to come in one of the locked doors to be able to use the restroom during your class. So it's not unheard of for schools to have a one entrance, one exit policy. And the idea is that you can exit the school from all these other doors, but you just can't enter the school through all of these other doors. So it's really not a very difficult thing to implement, but the left would like to say that it is because they, again, want to shift the focus back on guns. But that's like one really easy solution to help schools be more secure, or, hiring armed guards, things like that. But still, that's more of a surface level solution because it addresses how to stop school shooters once they've already decided to go on a rampage. We never really talk about addressing the reasons why young men decide to shoot up schools. And I think there's a lot of reasons that we should be talking about, one of which is fatherlessness in the home. This school shooter apparently had his father was alive and somewhat involved in his life, but overall generally pretty absent from the situation. And he talked about the fact that his son didn't believe that he loved him. And young men without a strong masculine force, a father figure to guide them throughout life, end up becoming very lost and isolated. And that's a really quick way to have a young man decide to do something really terrible as a means of attention or self-sabotage or what have you. Then there's the public school system, which we're not allowed to talk about because the power of teachers' unions. I just mentioned I went to public school. I recognize that for kids who are already at risk of being left behind, public school is not a good place for them to be. This is not a place where you have a lot of personalized attention, where you have a lot of care for you beyond your academics. There's not really a safety net in place to make sure that these kids who are already struggling don't fall through the cracks. And unless you have, one really good teacher or one really good person in your sports or extracurricular activities that is looking out for you and is willing to go that extra mile to take care of you and make sure that you're okay, then you're definitely at risk for being left behind and not really having a support system, not having a community, because public schools can be such big, isolating places. And there's also a high level of molestation in public schools, which people don't want to talk about. They point to the Catholic Church, they point to the Baptist Church. Yes, there are problems that need to be reformed there, but every study that's been done has shown that molestation rates are much higher in public schools than in any religious institution. And again, we can't talk about it because the teachers' unions have really garnered control over so much of the political establishment. And if you are sexually abused as a young person, you are at a much higher risk for committing crimes and a whole load of other really negative outcomes. But if you're talking about a school shooter who is in public school, maybe had sexual abuse as a child, maybe doesn't have a father in the home, that is a really volatile cocktail for a young person and could cause them to do all kinds of crazy things. And then when we get beyond, those specific things, we also have just in general a society that has devalued religion and has devalued community. We don't have the same social ties that we did back in the 80s and the 90s. We don't have the same rates of churchgoers that we did just a few decades ago. We have a higher than ever percentage of Americans who identify as atheist or agnostic or as non-religious. And when you don't have that underlying value system to orient you in life, again, you can end up taking some steps that lead to some very immoral and evil places because you are searching for something and lacking meaning and lacking purpose in life. We also had the pandemic lockdowns, which were apparently cited as one of the motivations for this specific shooter feeling isolated and like he needed to lash out in some way, because for 2 years, the government kept people in their homes. They told them they couldn't work, they couldn't see their friends, their family, they couldn't go to church, go to school, and there was a real mental health crisis, particularly for teenagers and young adults, that was born out of the lockdowns that no one seems to want to grapple with, especially not public health officials who recommended these lockdowns in the first place, only to find out that they didn't really do a whole lot in stopping the spread of COVID. And finally, right now, we're facing a lot of economic uncertainty with inflation and joblessness rates, the stock market crashing, and the price of goods going through the roof. We have supply chain issues. So all of these other societal factors can play so much into why something like this happens. But we never want to dig below the surface. We want to say that there's just one quick fix to stopping school shootings, when really it's been about the degradation of our culture and the political choices that we've made for the better part of 30, 40 years that is spurring these young men to take desperate and horrible actions and take other people's lives. And until we start really exploring the root of why people lash out in this way, there's only so much you can do to stop this. There's only so much school security you can have. You know, there's only so much gun control you can have. There's only so much reform to the police force that you can have. There's other things that need to be done on a societal level in order to nip this in the bud. We're moving right along to the Florida Inspectors General report that came out last week that confirmed that Florida did not cook its COVID numbers. They just were better than the rest of the country. Early in the pandemic, a lot of us pointed to Florida as the test case for how to properly handle COVID because Governor Ron DeSantis pretty quickly lifted all of the restrictions and lockdowns on businesses and beaches, and the media had a collective meltdown. They were flying drones over the beaches and calling him Death Santis and talking about how he was going to kill his entire state. And it quickly turned out that Florida actually had some of the best COVID outcomes in the entire country, with low case rates, low hospitalization rates, and low death rates. But many were just unwilling to believe that this could possibly be the case. I mean, how can you ignore Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Rachel Levine and the entire public health establishment and somehow have better outcomes than all of the states that had strict lockdowns? It just didn't make sense to them. Andrew Cuomo was supposed to be the hero of the pandemic. So the narrative that came out was that Florida must have been cooking the books. They were hiding deaths. They were hiding hospitalizations, and overall just deleting data to try to give us this false impression that they were doing really well. The only explanation for Florida having good COVID outcomes was that they must be lying. And this suspicion was confirmed by a so-called whistleblower by the name of Rebecca Jones, who was working on Florida's COVID dashboard. The media claimed that she was a data scientist and that she had seen firsthand and had been told to undercount COVID deaths, that she should falsify positive test rates, and that Florida health officials had removed an entire section of data from its website as part of the cover-up. Well, the Inspector General's report finally came out, and it was obtained by NBC News, and the Inspector General's report says that Rebecca Jones's claims were, quote, unsubstantiated and unfounded. There was, quote, insufficient evidence that Jones was asked to change COVID data. In addition, the state officials who temporarily removed a section of data were, quote, exonerated because they were found to have done so to ensure no private health information was being shared. So the state officials apparently removed a section of the website for less than 24 hours to make sure that no private health information was in that section of data, and then that section was promptly restored as soon as they were able to verify that everything on there was safe for public consumption. The IG report did not look at Jones's claim that she was asked to delete death data from the Florida COVID dashboard because she didn't even file that accusation in her complaint. And in fact, she has admitted publicly since her initial accusation that that portion never even happened, and tried to claim that she never said it, but she said it multiple times that she had been asked to delete Florida death data. Not only was she incorrectly referred to as a data scientist by all of these media outlets who covered her claims, but they all really ran with this without a hint of suspicion or skepticism. CNN interviewed her many times. allowed her to push the narrative that a police raid on her home was meant to silence her accusations against Florida Republicans, even though it was actually because she had stolen state medical data that included private information of Florida residents. And she's not a data scientist. In fact, the Inspector General report makes quite clear that she was basically tasked with organizing the Florida COVID dashboard, but that she actually didn't even have the ability to change any of the data that was within it. So her claim that she would have been asked to delete deaths or otherwise manipulate data had to be bunk because she didn't even have the authority to do any of that or any of the access to the database to be able to do that. Yet somehow Rebecca Jones was able to get all of this media attention that she was able to leverage into a congressional run. She's actually still running against Matt Gaetz as a Democrat and has managed to fundraise all kinds of money, and she has a GoFundMe of people supporting her, and she's managed to convince millions of Americans that Florida lied about its COVID numbers. And I can't help but think that Rebecca Jones and her acceptance by the mainstream media probably led a lot of public health officials to continue with lockdowns and other restrictive COVID policies without worrying about the negative effects, because they truly believed that Florida wasn't actually doing well and they were lying about their numbers. So they just continued on business as usual and ignored the fact that the lockdowns were causing mental health crises. They were causing people to not go to the hospital and get preventative care or get cancer treatments and a whole host of other really horrible latent side effects from the lockdowns, because Florida, as the test case, was only accepted by conservatives and Republicans and people on the right who had just a base level of skepticism about the way public health officials were handling COVID. So Rebecca Jones bears a lot of blame for, I think, in general, the way people handled COVID and public health officials handled COVID, and certainly tons of Americans having this really false impression about Florida's numbers. But I am glad that this report finally came out and that we have vindication and facts to back up that Florida had one of the best responses to COVID, and they did so by allowing people to make choices about their own health and live freely. We'll talk about partying Paul Pelosi in just a moment, but first, a quick news update for you guys. First, Michael Sussman, the Clinton-backed lawyer who was accused of giving false statements to the FBI, has been found not guilty by a DC jury. Unfortunately, not surprising, DC is a pretty liberal city, but the evidence against Sussman, as we went over in last week's episode, I thought was pretty overwhelming. He said in a text message to an FBI agent that he was not meeting with them on behalf of a client when he wanted to shop damaging information about Donald Trump, even though he was being paid by Hillary Clinton at the time. As I have said from the beginning, the Durham investigation has uncovered a lot of nonsense related to Crossfire Hurricane, but it's very unlikely that these people will see justice because that is the way of the DC swamp. Next, Paramount Plus and a whole host of other companies, including Joann's Fabrics, have sponsored a child drag show that includes the following. Let's give this a watch. For those of you who are unable to see the clip because you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, it basically just shows a bunch of children running around on stage with drag queens, having money thrown at them. So that's great. And this event was apparently sponsored by Paramount Plus, Anastasia Beverly Hills Cosmetics, Joann's Fabrics, the LA Public Library, Singer, which I believe is the Sewing Company, the Golden Girls, and RuPaul Drag Race. So that's wonderful. We're having more drag kids now. And finally, the Biden administration has just recognized June as Pride Month, and in their statement acknowledging June as Pride Month, they say that there are laws across the U.S. denying, quote, health care to transgender children. So it wasn't enough to call abortion health care. Now we're also calling the genital mutilation and sterilization of children health care. Great. Anyway, moving right along. Paul Pelosi, husband to Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, was arrested this weekend for allegedly driving under the influence. Paul Pelosi was reportedly leaving a dinner party when he ran a stop sign in his 2021 Porsche and was rear-ended by a Jeep. The police came to the accident scene and discovered that Paul Pelosi was apparently over the legal BAC limit of .08. He was arrested shortly before midnight and was booked at the Napa County Jail. He was eventually released on a $5,000 bail, and Nancy Pelosi is not commenting on the matter. According to her spokesperson, Drew Hamill, the speaker will not be commenting on this private matter, which occurred while she was on the East Coast. I find this very interesting because Nancy Pelosi is reportedly a teetotaler, meaning she doesn't drink, but the couple actually own a vineyard together in Napa County in California. It is a private vineyard, but they do sell wine. I think it's a little odd to own a business venture where you're not actually able to sample or test the quality of the wares that you're selling, but perhaps that's Paul Pelosi's hobby and not Nancy Pelosi's. I think maybe she's more the prescription pill type anyway. But Paul Pelosi in his Porsche allegedly ran a stop sign, although his attorney claims that he never ran the stop sign and that the accident was totally the Jeep's fault. That, of course, seems to be focusing on the wrong issue here. I think maybe we should be more concerned with the fact that Paul Pelosi was driving under the influence rather than who was actually at fault for the accident. So, very interesting situation. We'll see what happens with Paul Pelosi. Maybe he'll get some community service. I would love to see the Speaker of the House's husband on the side of the road having to pick up trash in a high-vis vest. That would be just a tiny amount of karma for Nancy Pelosi's COVID hypocrisy back when she had to go get her hair cut and claim that she needed it because she was so important compared to everybody else because she's on TV all the time. And then she tried to claim that the salon owner set her up. So I don't know. It's just like a nice little knock at the privileged for Paul's 2021 Porsche to have a little accident with a 2014 Jeep. This is probably one of the only times that the Pelosi's have to actually interact with us little people. And it's quite gratifying that they're actually being held accountable for their behavior, although it is a little odd that the police in this situation took, it looks like maybe an hour and a half to actually take Paul Pelosi into custody, and then it took them like almost 12 hours to actually book him at the local jail. So a bit of an odd situation. We'll see what comes out of this. As I just said about the Sussman verdict, you can never count on powerful people having to pay consequences for their actions. Leah Thomas is back in the news, and thankfully it's not because the male swimmer has stolen another championship title from a female swimmer, but it's because Leah Thomas has now given an exclusive interview to ESPN, which of course has given glowing coverage to the transgender swimmer ever since he started posting record times on the women's team for the University of Pennsylvania. The interview on ESPN starts with some nice orchestral music and allows Leah Thomas to talk about misconceptions that people have about him. Let's watch.
What do you think is the biggest misconception people have about you, specifically?
The biggest misconception, I think, is the reason why I transitioned, where people will say, oh, she just transitioned, so she would have an advantage, so she could win. I transitioned to be happy, to be true to myself.
Look, I would be really surprised if anyone would intentionally take hormone therapy and transition genders just because they wanted to win athletic championships. Clearly, there are unresolved mental health issues that are leading people like Leah Thomas to feel like they're in the wrong body, and they think the solution to that is mutilating themselves or chemically castrating themselves or whatever other steps they take to affirm their gender. But we go on into the next part of this interview, and Leah Thomas just goes on to deny basic biological reality and create straw man arguments for why he should be allowed to compete in women's sports. Let's go ahead and watch.
Trans women competing in women's sports does not threaten women's sports as a whole, because trans women are a very small minority of all athletes, and the NCAA rules regarding trans women competing in women's sports have been around for 10 plus years, and we haven't seen any massive wave of trans women dominating.
Let's go ahead and break down Leah Thomas's logic here. He claims that because trans women, aka biological men, or just men, are a small minority of competitors in women's sports, that they're not a threat to female athletes. This is, first of all, not true, because any man who is able to take the podium and knock off female swimmers, who are then reduced to second or third place or not even given a medal at all, that is immoral. That is unethical. That is unfair. It doesn't matter how many people are doing it, so long as a woman is adversely affected by a man's performance in that sport, then that is not right. And second, Leah Thomas's logic here actually suggests that he understands that there is a biological difference between him and women, because he justifies it by saying, well, there's only a couple of us. But if you scaled up to include a lot of men into women's competition, then he suggests that there would be a problem and there would be unfairness to the women who are competing. If a man on average has a greater athletic ceiling, a significantly greater athletic ceiling, as we've seen by Leah Thomas's swimming times compared to women, than the average woman, then that is an unfair competition. This is why men and women were split up into different athletic teams to begin with. And when we go beyond individual sports to team sports, there's a safety issue that's involved. Men can absolutely take out women on the sports field if they're allowed to start playing on soccer teams or field hockey teams or softball or any other sport that has either a minimal or full level of contact. I used to play field hockey in college, and I played on the club team, which was one level below Division I, and I can tell you guys, we were actually allowed to have men on our team, but we were only allowed to have 2 on the field at a time because it was recognized that they had just an innate athletic and biological advantage to the average woman, and if you had a team full of men playing against a team full of women, there were a lot of safety hazards involved. Because the men that we played with were stronger, faster, more agile, there were so many collisions involved between the men and the women. The men had a faster shot speed that could honestly kill a woman if it hit her in the wrong spot, whether it was in the head or otherwise. And so you're creating dangerous situations when you allow biological men to compete against biological women unchecked on team sports. This hasn't been an issue in swimming, but again, it's still an unfair competition. When I hear Leah Thomas say, my presence in the pool is not affecting female athletes, all I can think is, that's easy for him to say. He is not the one who is losing opportunities. He is not the one who has to enter a locker room with someone who still has male genitalia and is walking around naked, essentially sexually harassing his teammates. He's not the one who has to endure going to their coaches and telling them that they're uncomfortable, and the coaches say, well, you need to get therapy, or you need to just get over it, or you need to change in a different locker room, even though this is supposed to be a women's space. He's not the one who has to see that a biological man is touching the wall before them in a championship meet. It is so easy for him to say. And as one of my very astute Twitter followers said, it takes a lot of balls to say something like that to ESPN. And ESPN sure has a lot of balls by giving this glowing profile to Leah Thomas. You can see at the end of the interview, the interviewer asks Leah Thomas if it was all worth it and allows Leah Thomas to give this nice, inspiring answer. And the shots show Leah Thomas with his male face, male voice, and male body doing glamour shots in a female one-piece swimming suit. It's all so bizarre and ridiculous. And ESPN used to be the outlet that would cry about women not getting equal pay compared to men in sports, which is a topic for a whole other conversation. But they went from trying to be champions for women's sports to turning around and giving this huge platform to a man who is taking opportunities away from female athletes. And this is the logical inconsistency these people use to justify refusing to acknowledge truth in biology and just basic fairness. And it's so sad to watch as a former athlete myself. It is devastating to see what these women have had to deal with. And I only hope that in the future, parents continue to stand up and fight back against this nonsense. And allow me to indulge myself for just a moment by pointing out that I went to Georgetown, and the Georgetown president, John DeGioia, who is the first layperson in the history of the oldest Catholic institution or Catholic university in the country, is actually in charge of the NCAA board that makes up these transgender rules. So it is a president of a Catholic university, a religion that is supposed to be dedicated to the truth, who is allowing men to compete and take opportunities from women. It's so infuriating, and one of a million reasons why I don't donate money to my alma mater, because these are the types of policies that they are involved in curating, and it is so disappointing, so bizarre, so not based in truth or reality that it's hard to wrap my head around the fact that people even accept this as a real thing, that a man can swim next to a woman in the pool, and we are all supposed to celebrate him as a hero. That's it for this week's episode of Unfit to Print. As always, thank you guys for watching. If you liked this episode, please subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And again, go check out our new premium tiers on amberathey.supercast.com, and we will see you next week.